In the archives of the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, there is a map from 1513 that cartographers have been arguing about for 5 centuries. It is drawn on gazelle skin. It measures roughly 90 by 65 centimeters, and in its lower portion, curving along what should be the empty southern edge of the known world, there is a coastline, a massive one, detailed, continuous, drawn with the kind of specificity that suggests someone had been there. The problem is that no one had. I came to this through a conversation I did not expect to have. A researcher I had been corresponding with about medieval cartographic manuscripts mentioned, almost as an aside, that the southern landmass on certain 16th century maps bore geographic features that could not have been derived from any voyage documented in the official record. She named 3 specific maps. She said the level of detail was, in her word, uncomfortable. I spent the following months trying to understand what she meant. What I found was not a single anomaly, but a pattern that the official history of exploration has never fully resolved. Here is what the map from 1513 shows. In the region below the 40th parallel south, where 16th century European navigators had barely sailed, and where the continent of Antarctica would not be officially sighted for another 3 centuries, there is a landmass with defined bays, promontories, and a continuous interior suggested by the lines of its coast. The cartographer who made it was an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. He was working in Constantinople. He had access, he wrote himself, to approximately 20 source maps, including charts he claimed came from the voyages of Christopher Columbus and from Portuguese sources he does not name. The question that the map raises, and that no one has answered to my satisfaction, is what those Portuguese sources contained. Because some of what appears on that southern coastline does not correspond to anything a 16th century Portuguese captain is recorded to have seen. The official history of Antarctic discovery begins in 1820. That is when Fabian Bellingshausen, commanding a Russian naval expedition, recorded the first confirmed sighting of the continent's mainland. Before that, the consensus position is that no one had seen it, no one had mapped it, and no one could have. James Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle in 1773 and found no habitable continent. He concluded, with reasonable confidence, that if a southern landmass existed, it was locked inside the polar ice and offered nothing worth claiming. The exploration community largely accepted this. The maps, slowly and unevenly, began to reflect it. But here's what I cannot stop returning to. The maps that predated Cook by 2 and 3 centuries were not showing nothing in the south. They were showing something. Not uniformly, not consistently, not always with the same contours or in the same location, but with a persistence and a specificity that goes beyond what classical theory alone would have produced. Ptolemy had argued that a great southern landmass must exist for reasons of cosmological balance. But Ptolemy did not draw bays. He did not draw river mouths. He did not draw the particular curve of a coastline at a specific latitude. The cartographers who came after him did. And the question I have not been able to answer is where that specificity came from. And by 1897, that continent was gone from the maps entirely. Not because anyone had proven it didn't exist, but because by then, the people who needed to believe in it had stopped looking. The idea begins not with any explorer, but with a Greek astronomer who had never left the Mediterranean, and who died around 170 CE, having never seen the southern hemisphere. Claudius Ptolemy believed, on purely mathematical grounds, that the known landmasses of the north were too heavy. The world required balance. Something vast had to exist in the south to counterweight the continents above the equator, or the entire structure of the earth would be, in his framework, geometrically indefensible. He called it Terra Australis incognita, unknown southern land, and he drew it onto his maps without a single observation to support it. Not a sighting, not a report from a sailor, not a rumor carried back from a trading ship. Pure geometric logic, translated directly into cartographic fact. What I find difficult to move past is how quickly that logic became material. Ptolemy's geographic writings were lost to the Western world for roughly 12 centuries. When they were translated into Latin in 1406 and began circulating through European scholarly networks, his southern continent came with them, inherited intact. Mapmakers did not treat it as speculation. They treated it as an unfound place, which is a different thing entirely. And once it was an unfound place rather than a theoretical proposition, the question stopped being whether it existed and started being where, exactly, the coastline ran. By the mid-1400s, the continent had acquired details nobody had any business drawing. Not vague southern shading, not a cautious blank at the bottom of the page. Mountains, river deltas, harbors. The 1482 Ulm edition of Ptolemy's Geography shows a southern landmass connected to Africa and Asia, enclosing the Indian Ocean as a landlocked sea. The cartographers who drew these features were not frauds. They were doing what the system of knowledge they had inherited asked them to do, which was to complete the picture using the best available logic when observation ran out. Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation between 1519 and 1522 was the first serious empirical challenge to this picture. When his ships passed through the strait that now carries his name at the southern tip of South America, they found Tierra del Fuego to the south. Tierra del Fuego went immediately onto the maps as the northern coast of Terra Australis. The continent had not been disproven. It had been located. This is the pattern I kept encountering the deeper I went into the cartographic record. Every voyage that should have reduced the continent instead repositioned it. Drake's passage in 1578 pushed it further south when he found open ocean below Tierra del Fuego. Open ocean was not evidence of absence. It was evidence that the continent's northern boundary had been incorrectly drawn. The psychology of this is worth sitting with. Edward Brooke Hitching, who has spent years studying historical cartographic errors, documented the specific reluctance that governed how phantom geography persisted. No cartographer wanted to be the one to erase something without absolute confirmation of its non-existence. And absolute confirmation was effectively impossible in the Southern Ocean in the 16th and 17th centuries. The sea was unmapped, the winters were lethal, and the absence of a continent in one longitude said nothing definitive about the next. So the continent stayed. It shrank. It retreated southward on each successive generation of maps, retreating before the advancing line of verified observation, but it never disappeared. What it did do, across those 2 centuries, was accumulate authority. Gerardus Mercator placed it on his 1569 world map with a confidence that subsequent mapmakers inherited. Abraham Ortelius drew it in the same year with elaborated coastlines. The French cartographer Bouvet de Lozier was still commissioning voyages to find it in the 1730s. The continent's persistence was not ignorance. The men drawing it were among the most rigorous empiricists of their era. It persisted because the absence of disconfirming evidence across an ocean no one had fully crossed was not, by any reasonable standard of the time, proof that the continent wasn't there. James Cook would not challenge that standard until the 1770s. Before him, the southern continent was a working geographic hypothesis, supported by 3 centuries of inherited authority, and the mapmakers who drew it were not making an error in the terms their discipline gave them. They were filling in the unknown with the most credible available inference. By the mid-1700s, the continent had been chased into the polar regions, but it was still there on the maps, still waiting to be found, still promising something vast and unclaimed at the bottom of the world. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolò Zeno claimed to have found a box of old letters in a storeroom of his family's home. The letters, he said, had been written by 2 of his ancestors, Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, describing a voyage they had made through the northern Atlantic in the 1380s. Attached to the letters was a map. On that map, sitting just south of Iceland, was an island called Frisland. It had settlements with Italian-sounding names like Forlanda and Sorend. It looked, in other words, like a place someone had been. Nobody had been there. The island did not exist. What Niccolò Zeno the Younger had produced in 1558 was almost certainly a fabrication, assembled from fragments of genuine northern geography, reshaped and renamed, and attributed to ancestors who could not contradict him because they had been dead for 150 years. I find myself drawn back to this point repeatedly. The fabrication was not crude. It was detailed enough, and sourced to documents old enough, that the men who received it had no straightforward mechanism for refuting it. And so they copied it. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator, whose world map was the most technically sophisticated cartographic document produced in the 16th century, the map that navigation would be built upon for the next 200 years, added Frisland under the name Frisland. Abraham Ortelius put it in his 1570 atlas, which was the first standardized world atlas ever published, the reference work that educated Europeans consulted when they wanted to know what the world looked like. Within 12 years of Zeno's publication, Frisland had been endorsed by the two most authoritative cartographers alive. After that, the question of whether to include it was no longer really a question. You copied from Mercator, you copied from Ortelius. That was how maps were made. The mechanics of this matter enormously, because they explain something that the official history of cartography tends to skip over. A cartographer working in 1580 or 1600 or 1620 was not in a position to sail to the North Atlantic and check. The ocean between Scotland and Iceland was navigated, yes, but it was navigated for specific purposes, along specific routes, by sailors who were not geographers and who were not dispatched to confirm or deny particular features on theoretical documents. The absence of independent confirmation was not, in that context, evidence of absence. It was simply the ordinary condition of working at the edge of what had been mapped. And no cartographer wanted to be the one to erase a feature that Mercator himself had included without having proof that the erasure was correct. This is the institutional logic that kept Frisland alive. Not credulity exactly, and not conspiracy, something more mundane and more durable than either. The professional reluctance to contradict established authority without overwhelming evidence, combined with the practical impossibility of obtaining that evidence in the ordinary course of work. The island persisted on maps through the late 1500s and across most of the 1600s. Willem Bleu omitted it from his 1617 map of Europe, but put it back on his 1630 world map. A 1652 Vischer world map includes it, copied largely from Bleu. Tobias Conrad Lauder was still showing it, labeled Frislandia, on a world map published in 1775. More than 200 years after Zeno's fabrication, the island was still appearing in print. What I find difficult to set aside is the implication. If a place that never existed could achieve that level of cartographic authority, endorsed by Mercator, included by Ortelius, copied and recopied by generations of mapmakers who had every professional reason to be careful, then the question of what else the maps were carrying, unremarked and unverified, becomes considerably harder to dismiss. The maps were not neutral. They were documents produced by human beings working within specific institutional pressures, inheriting specific errors, and passing those errors forward in the guise of established knowledge. Frisland is the clearest case because it is unambiguous. There is nothing to argue about. The island was invented, and then it was perpetuated, and the mechanism of its perpetuation was identical to the mechanism that perpetuated genuine geographic knowledge. The two were indistinguishable from inside the archive. The island that had never existed outlasted the careers of the men who drew it, and nobody who copied it onto their own maps seems to have asked the obvious question: has anyone actually been there? The Piri Reis Map was found in 1929 by a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann, who was cataloging materials in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, and who almost certainly had no idea what he was looking at. The map is drawn on gazelle skin. It measures roughly 35 by 24 inches. Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, completed it in 1513, and he left notes in the margins explaining his sources. He lists approximately 20 reference charts. Some were Portuguese, some were older. One, he writes, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. The map was filed away, unstudied, for 416 years. What Deissmann found when he unrolled it was not just a historical curiosity. It was, for certain researchers who came after him, evidence that someone in 1513 knew something they had no business knowing. The western coastlines of Europe and Africa are accurate. The Atlantic is rendered with a precision that contemporary European cartographers were only beginning to approach. But it is the southern edge of the map that has generated 5 decades of scholarly argument. Below the recognizable coastline of South America, there is land, a continuous landmass running along the bottom of the map, detailed with bays and inlets, and what appear to be coastal features. The mainstream reading is that this is Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, distorted by the projection Piri Reis was using. The alternative reading, and I want to be careful here about exactly what the alternative reading claims, is that it shows something further south than any European expedition had reached by 1513. The researcher who pushed this argument furthest was Charles Hapgood, an American historian who published a detailed analysis of the Piri Reis map in 1966. His book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, argued that the southern landmass on the map corresponded not to Patagonia, but to the coastline of Antarctica, specifically to what the Antarctic coastline would have looked like before it was covered by the ice sheet that now conceals it. Hapgood calculated that the match was too precise to be coincidental. He argued that Piri Reis must have been working from source maps that predated the glaciation of Antarctica, which geologists date to somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000 years ago. This is the claim that the mainstream cartographic community rejects, and their objections are specific. The projection Piri Reis used was centered on Cairo, not on any point that would have given him accurate southern coordinates. Stretching a Ptolemaic projection across that distance produces exactly the kind of southward distortion that would push Patagonia into a position resembling an Antarctic coastline. The bays and inlets Hapgood identified as matches for subglacial Antarctic features can also be matched, point for point, to known features of the South American coast. There is no version of this argument that does not require some selection of which comparisons to emphasize. But here is what I cannot stop returning to. The question of whether Hapgood was right about Antarctica is almost separate from the more documented question of what Piri Reis was actually working from. His margin notes are not vague. He identifies his sources with the specificity of a man who understood that his sources mattered. He names Portuguese charts that no longer exist. He references a map he describes as dating to classical antiquity. We do not have those source documents. The chain of transmission that produced the 1513 map runs backward into an archive that has not survived. And the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty what Piri Reis was copying, or how far back his information reached. I spent considerable time on this specific problem. What the academic literature confirms is narrow. The map exists. It contains a southern landmass. The margin notes claim ancient sources, and the precise identity of those sources cannot be verified. What the literature disputes is everything else. The cartographic historian Gregory McIntosh published the most detailed technical refutation of Hapgood's work in 2000, examining the map projection and concluding that the southern landmass is almost certainly a composite of South American coastline data assembled under the distortions of the Ptolemaic system. His analysis is thorough. It is also, in one specific place, honest about its own limits. He writes that some of the source charts Piri Reis used cannot be identified, and that their origin remains unknown. That gap is not small. Frisland survived on maps for over a century because no cartographer wanted to erase something without confirmation. Terra Australis survived for 3 centuries on the logic that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, when the ocean in question was still largely unsailed. The Piri Reis map operates on a different logic entirely. It is not a case of something being added from imagination and then reluctantly removed. It is a case of something being present on a map whose sources we have not fully traced, in a configuration that the official history of exploration does not completely account for. The mainstream explanation is that Piri Reis assembled the map from earlier Portuguese sources, and that what looks like a southern coastline is Patagonia, stretched and distorted by the projection. And that explanation may be entirely correct, but it requires you to believe that the distortion happened to produce something that matches a coastline nobody would confirm for another 3 centuries. James Cook left Plymouth in July of 1772 with 2 ships and a specific assignment: find the southern continent or prove it didn't exist. The Resolution and the Adventure carried 193 men and enough provisions for a voyage that their commanders understood might last years. The men who funded the expedition understood that the answer, whatever it was, would have consequences that extended well beyond cartography. Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle in January of 1773. He crossed it again in December of that year, pushing further south than any European expedition before him. He found no continent. What he found was ice, open water, the absence of the thing he had been sent to confirm. His conclusion, recorded in his journal and reported to the Admiralty on his return in 1775, was specific. If a southern continent existed at all, it lay within the polar ice in conditions that made it, in his words, not worth the discovery. He was saying that even if it did, it was not the fertile, temperate landmass that 3 centuries of cartographic imagination had placed there. The cartographic response to Cook's findings was not immediate. That compression obscures something important about how geographic knowledge actually moves through institutions. The French cartographers were among the first to respond seriously. Philippe Voyage had been one of the most aggressive advocates for the southern continent in the mid-18th century, producing detailed maps of a landmass he had never seen but had reconstructed from what he considered logical geographic principles. After Cook, the Voyage school of theoretical geography lost standing. By the 1780s, the major French atlases had begun withdrawing the continent's more elaborate features, the river systems, the mountain ranges drawn from pure speculation, and replacing them with the vaguer notation of unknown southern regions. The Dutch and British followed more slowly. This was because it wasn't simply inertia. The Admiralty Charts Office in London, that by the late 18th century was the most authoritative cartographic institution in the world, did not issue a definitive revision of Southern Hemisphere charts until well into the 1790s. Part of the delay was epistemic. Cook had found no continent. But absence of evidence over a single voyage was not the same as disproof. Part of it was something else. The continent had been a claim before it was a map. European colonial administration had spent 3 centuries gesturing toward the southern lands as territory that could in principle be controlled, taxed, settled, and exploited. Removing the continent from the official charts meant abandoning the territorial logic that had organized significant portions of Southern Hemisphere colonial ambition. The British East India Company had strategic interests in the southern trade routes. The French colonial administration had made calculations about the value of the southern lands that depended on those lands existing in a form worth administering. Revising the maps was not a neutral act of scientific correction. It was an institutional decision with economic and legal downstream consequences. The emerging professional geographic societies of the late 18th century made this more complicated, not less. The Royal Geographical Society was founded in 1830, by which point the major cartographic authorities had already stripped most versions of Terra Australis from working navigational charts. But the Society's early publications still carried discussions of what might lie within the polar ice. There were 2 parallel cartographic cultures operating simultaneously. The professional navigational culture, that had largely accepted Cook's findings. The popular and scientific publishing culture, that was slower to close the question because the question, held open, sold books and funded expeditions. The discovery of the actual Antarctic coastline, beginning in 1820, should have settled everything. 3 separate expeditions, a Russian, an American, a British, sighted the continental landmass within months of each other. What they found was not the temperate southern continent of the maps. It was ice shelf and rock, uninhabitable, and without the resources that 3 centuries of speculation had promised. But even this did not produce an immediate cartographic consensus. The maps of the 1820s and 1830s that incorporated the new Antarctic sightings were inconsistent, incomplete. In some cases, continued to show older speculative features alongside the newly observed coastlines. The official erasure took decades longer than it should have. In the gap between when the evidence arrived and when the maps caught up, the continent kept appearing on documents that still carried legal and territorial weight. The continent that Cook failed to find was not just a geographic theory. It had been, for 3 centuries, one of the primary justifications for why ships kept sailing south. What Terra Australis offered, on paper, was extraordinary. The continent drawn on maps from the 1500s through the late 1700s was not a featureless mass. It had river systems. It had interior regions marked with names. It had coastlines that implied harbors, and harbors implied trade, and trade implied wealth of the kind that funded navies. The men who commissioned voyages south were not chasing an abstraction. They were chasing something that cartographers had drawn with the same confidence they used to draw France. The continent was, in the logic of the age, simply unclaimed. And unclaimed, in the 16th and 17th centuries, was the same word as available. There was a theological argument underneath the geographic one. Ptolemy's original reasoning, that a massive southern landmass had to exist to balance the weight of the northern continents, had migrated from astronomy into doctrine by the time European powers were organizing their colonial ambitions. God's creation was ordered. It was proportional. It did not tip. The southern continent wasn't merely a commercial opportunity. It was, for many of the scholars who wrote about it, evidence of divine design. That framing gave it a staying power that pure commercial speculation would not have sustained. It was considerably harder to argue with the architecture of creation. The navigational argument was more practical, and in some ways, more durable. A continent in the southern latitudes would have anchored trade routes between the Atlantic and the Pacific in ways that the existing geography did not permit. The passage around Cape Horn was brutal. A landmass further north, in more temperate waters, would have changed the mathematics of every southern voyage. Mariners who never expected to find farmland still wanted to find something they could stop at, something that could serve as a waypoint between the known world and whatever lay beyond it. Terra Australis, on the maps, was exactly that. What Cook found, and what the expeditions of the 1820s and 1830s confirmed, was that none of this was there. The continent that existed was locked under ice that began at the coast and did not stop. It had no harbors in any meaningful sense. It had no interior that could be farmed, no river systems that could carry goods, no temperate zones where a trading post could survive a winter. The theological symmetry argument collapsed with it. If God had placed a counterweight at the bottom of the world, he had placed it somewhere that no ship could reach and nothing could grow. This is the part of the story that official histories of exploration tend to move past quickly. But what the correction also did was close something. For 3 centuries, the Southern Ocean had been understood as the approach to something. After Cook, it was the approach to nothing that any of the interested parties had imagined. The question of what lay beyond the ice had kept fleets funded and expeditions organized and governments paying attention to the far south. That question was answered by 1840, and the answer ended the particular kind of hope that had sustained the asking. I keep returning to a specific problem in the record here. The men who had devoted careers to finding Terra Australis did not simply update their maps and move forward. The geographic societies of Britain and France, which had spent decades arguing about the probable location and extent of the southern continent, went quiet on the subject with a speed that is itself worth noting. The institutional enthusiasm that had financed southern voyages did not transfer to the actual Antarctica that had been confirmed. The real continent, ice-locked and economically inert, attracted scientific interest, but not the organized commercial attention that the imagined continent had generated for 3 centuries. By 1897, the last maps carrying any version of the mythological southern continent had been formally corrected or quietly withdrawn from circulation. The geographic record was accurate. It was also, in every measurement that had mattered to the people financing the old maps, considerably smaller than what they had been drawing. What the old maps had shown was not what the new maps confirmed, and the men who had built entire careers on the promise of what lay beyond the ice had to decide, quietly, whether to say that out loud. There is a pattern in the history of phantom cartography that is difficult to explain away once you have seen it. The mechanism that preserved Frisland on European maps for more than 130 years was not ignorance. The cartographers who copied it were not careless men. What they shared was something more structural than error, a professional reluctance to remove what a trusted authority had placed, an institutional logic that treated absence of disproof as sufficient grounds for continuation. The cost of wrongly removing something was higher, in professional terms, than the cost of wrongly keeping it. That same logic, scaled across 3 centuries and an entire continent, is what kept Terra Australis on the maps until Cook's second voyage made its continued presence professionally indefensible. And once I understood that the same institutional inertia produced both the 130-year phantom island and the 300-year phantom continent, I found myself asking a question the official history of cartography does not spend much time with. What if the process ran in both directions? We know that fictional geography survived through institutional copying. We know that the correction of that geography was slow, politically complicated, and driven as much by the consolidation of national scientific bodies as by the actual accumulation of evidence. The French geographic societies, the British Admiralty, the emerging professional class of cartographers who needed to distinguish themselves from the tradition they were replacing. These institutions had reasons to erase the old maps that had nothing to do with pure accuracy. Removing Terra Australis was not just a scientific act, it was a claim about who now held the authority to determine what the world contained. Here is the part that I cannot stop returning to. The old maps were not uniform. The cartographers who drew Terra Australis were working from sources. Some were the first-hand accounts of navigators, whose logs have partially survived, and some were drawn from materials that have not survived at all. Charts, and observations and geographic intelligence gathered by Portuguese and Spanish expeditions, whose records were treated as state secrets and whose archives were not fully open to later researchers. When the correction came, it swept indiscriminately. The fictional geography and the empirical observations it had been layered over were removed together because by the 19th century, no one was in a position to separate them. The Piri Reis Map is the clearest example of this problem. The mainstream explanation that the southern coastline is Patagonia, distorted by projection, may be entirely correct. What I am arguing is that Piri Reis documented his own sources. He listed them. He named charts from Portuguese expeditions, from navigators whose original records have not been located, from geographic intelligence that passed through the Ottoman court and then largely stopped passing anywhere at all. When researchers assessed the Piri Reis map in the 20th century, they were assessing it against sources they could find. The sources Piri Reis himself cited are, in significant number, gone. Not lost in the way that things get misfiled, gone in the way that things go when the institutions that held them collapse, or when the political successors of those institutions had reasons to let them decay. This is not a claim that the old maps were accurate. Terra Australis was not real. Frisland was not real. The phantom geography was, in its broad outline, fiction layered over theory, layered over hope. What I am saying is that the process of correction was not a clean surgical removal of error. It was a wholesale replacement, carried out by institutions with their own agendas, working from sources they controlled, and the knowledge that existed in the older tradition, the empirical observations of navigators, whose logs fed into maps we now dismiss entirely, did not survive the replacement intact. The question the archive cannot settle is a specific one, not whether Terra Australis existed. It didn't. But whether some of the cartographers who drew its coastlines so carefully, for so long, from sources that no longer exist, recorded something real in the process of recording something false. Whether the correction that began with Cook and concluded with the standardization of cartographic authority in the late 19th century was complete in the way we were taught, or whether it was simply final. We closed the question in 1897 because by then we had better instruments, better ships, and better maps. And we have spent the centuries since assuming that better means complete.